I did my first duplex in that period in my mid-20s, because I kind of worked out mathematically that I could buy the land once and use it twice. But by the time I was 30, I had 30 properties. And really what I was doing is just leapfrogging equity.
This is Property Investory, where we talk to successful property investors to find out more about their stories, mindset and strategies. I'm Tyron Shum, and in this episode, we're speaking to property entrepreneur Keith Grisman of Property Only, who kickstarted his investing when he was 17 to building a portfolio of over 30 properties by the age of 30. We'll find out the mechanics behind this and how he used mathematics to leapfrog properties. Grisman is the founder of management specialist company Property Only, among several other property-related businesses, and describes himself as a property surfer.
Hi, I'm Keith Grisman. Property entrepreneur, I guess, is the best description for me, but I like to call it property surfer. Why do I say that? Because surfing is my absolute passion after my family, and property is an investment strategy and a lifestyle for me that allows me to do that. So my wife and I run a number of property-related businesses. We have a reasonably large residential property management role. We do some commercial management because it's a large area of my expertise in the past. We also have a couple of residential sales agencies, and we obviously do a fair bit of investing, which in turn often tends to be a little bit of property development activity.
In any given day, he likes to keep his routine flexible so as to make time for his family.
My day's random, and that's what I like. I'd like to say that I run my day by the tides and the swell, and look, that's partly true, but in reality, obviously, we've all got commitments. So I'm a full-time dad 50% of the time. I share my son with my ex-wife. So every second week, I need complete flexibility. I do the pick up and drop off every day. So all of our property businesses do revolve around me being able to be completely flexible.
Originally growing up in southern Sydney, Grisman's family quit the rat race of Sydney when he was a teenager.
I grew up in Sydney. I was proudly born in what's called Cogra or St George Hospital. My mum and dad had grown up there. They were very young when I was born, 17 and 19. So I was kind of born into a young adult world. I was dragged along to every circumstance. So I like to think that helped me a lot in terms of my early communication skills. Mum and dad eventually decided to leave what they called the rat race of Sydney when I was 14 turning 15, and we moved to Queensland. I thought it was about them and getting out of the rat race, but it turned out that really it was about my sister and I, and they thought there was much more opportunity in Queensland, and I completely think they were right. So, the peak of your adolescent years, I completely did not want to come. And the only way Dad managed to get me into the car was he showed me a map, which was where we were moving to, and it was 3 streets from the beach, and I couldn't get in the car fast enough.
Completing the final years of his tertiary education in Queensland, he was engaged in a stage of empowerment that cultivated early entrepreneurial skills.
We ended up living in a place called Bribie Island, which is completely in the middle of the outer limits of Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. And we were the first lot of graduating students through that brand new high school. So what was really cool about that is the principal really empowered us. I was the school captain, but he empowered our, the kind of student leadership group to do everything from designing the uniforms to putting some of the processes and procedures in place. So it was kind of like a little entrepreneurial lesson, and he was clearly teaching us and playing with us without us knowing what was going on, but it was a fantastic experience.
Wow, that would be awesome to have a school teacher like that, and people to encourage people or children to do that. That is just, yeah, it's unheard of, to be honest. I haven't actually heard that in schools at all.
It was so lucky. Yeah. I got, obviously at school there's a tussle with the principal, and there was that. Like we're all trying to get away with stuff, and he's trying to keep us on the rails. but I was blessed that I had him. His name was Greg Peach, and to sidetrack on that, about 5 years ago, I was walking out of my office, and there he is sitting, and I had seen him a few times beforehand. I know his kids. He's sitting in a restaurant with a group of about 10 other clearly teachery looking people. I walked over and said hello, and it was his retirement party.
Oh, wow.
So I literally happened to walk into his retirement party, so I got a chance to say the things that you'd like to say to that favourite teacher or that favourite principal that you maybe always don't get as a young kid to say, and it was fantastic.
After this amazing high school experience, Grisman was motivated to get a job quickly.
I seem to remember that it was Boxing Day after I finished grade 12, and I'd applied to, a whole bunch of unis and TAFEs and kind of figured I'd keep all of my options open. And I was watching the cricket on Boxing Day, and Dad walked in and basically gave me a serve and said, "What are you doing with your life? Why are you sitting on the couch? Why don't you have a job yet?" So my dad was the son of a Russian Jew, so a Russian immigrant, and Dad was 19 when I was born, so he worked a pretty intense life with a young family, so he wasn't one for sitting around much. An ad came on the TV for the Queensland Police Service, looking for jobs, and I pointed at the TV and I said, "Dad, I'm going to do that."
What was his response to that?
I don't even remember what he said, but it was one of those serendipitous moments that was both silly and also life-changing. So what I didn't know at the time is the Fitzgerald inquiry had just run through the Queensland Police, and they were doing the single biggest intake ever, which was 400 students, or 400 cadets. 10,000 people applied, and somehow I managed to fall my way into the last 400. And I started there in February after literally getting a call the day before and saying, "Hey, you're in. What are you doing in the morning?" I drove down to the police academy at Oxley, and my life as a policeman started, basically.
However, this stint didn't last longer than 3 years before he decided to do other things.
It was a fantastic 3 years, I got to say. Like you do in your early life, I've met some amazing people, some lifelong friends, and the things that I learnt in the police about people, the community, communication, all those sorts of things are things that have stood me in great stead all of my life. But it was a pretty short stint. I loved it, but it's I'm a born entrepreneur and I didn't know it then, so necessarily it wasn't the place for me. So I left there and did a couple of really odd things. So because I did 3 years there, I missed the gap year / backpack around the place. So I kind of toured around a bit, and I ran a farm in Tasmania for a while with the B&B attached to it. I sold saucepans door to door, which was fantastic for sales skills. And in a couple of those jobs, I definitely learned what I didn't want to do as opposed to what I really did want to do. And then I ended up working for a property developer on their real estate sales and marketing side. So that got my, professional property career started. But from a day-to-day property investment perspective, when I was 17 at the police academy, I bought my first property. So I guess that's really where it started.
The influence to start investing in property so young stemmed from Grisman's father, who was always looking for ways to add value to their home.
Yeah, my dad's an electrician. So growing up, I grew up in a house that I guess you could best describe as was being, eternally renovated. We only probably lived in 3 or 4 houses while I was at home, but, Dad was always looking to value add. And so for whatever reason, I'm just blessed that, and that's most likely the Russian Jew heritage on my dad's side, but I'm just really good with numbers. And so I just remember how much they bought a house for, how much they sold it for. So I guess at 17, property just made sense to me, and I knew that, 1 and 1 could equal, 2.2.
With his father's experience as an electrician and his leaning towards renovating, the family moved around a lot.
My mum used to say that my dad was part gypsy, because we did move a bit, but just in the context, again, mum and dad were 17, 19 when I was born. I don't know about you, but at 17 and 19 and even at 27 and 29, I'm not sure I knew what I was doing, the next year, let alone on a long-term basis. So I think they just did the best that they could in terms of trying to survive. So, yeah, it was only 4 or 5 houses, I guess, in the, 17 years that I lived at home. But one thing's for sure, we never lived in a house that didn't get regularly updated or changed or, in a term that we now know, value added to.
Grisman worked for a property developer, which kick-started his property career, and he learned a lot that chalked up to experience.
The property developer that I worked for, he was a large land subdivider. So, I mean, like some examples people might know is Washington and Myer developments. They were kind of pretty atypical, buying large englobo parcels on the fringe of town and, sometimes beyond the fringe, and then cutting them up and taking people there. So these guys did pretty much that. So basically what they did is they sat us in a real estate sales office, and we were effectively asked to pretend to be day-to-day residential real estate agents, but with the specific task of selling their land. I can't say it's a model that I particularly liked, but I learnt a lot about the property business there. And as I said before, with some of the other jobs I had, I think it's really important to learn what you don't want to do as much as what you do want to do, because I think that can, shape your activities and your energy as well as your ethics.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing is that it's easy to just do the things that you enjoy, but if you don't actually get experience what it's like to do the things that you don't like and experience it overall, you won't know, because in the end of the day, you might actually jump into it down the track and realize, holy moly, I spent all that time doing the things I hated, and then realizing, gosh, I had all that time to learn about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in those environments, there's a lot to be said for osmosis, right? There's people around you who are, buying and selling and building and, thinking and talking, and I guess if you've got the right filter, you can try and absorb the good stuff and discard the bad stuff.
Although enjoying the sales side of working for a property developer, the ethics side of it didn't sit well with Grisman. He then moved on to a different company in the Sunshine Coast.
I learned a lot, but it was time to move on. And there was this little ad in the paper, and I don't really remember what it said, except it said Sunshine Coast and it said property. And I wanted to get up on the coast because obviously of my love of surfing. So I turned up for this job, and really what they were looking for was kind of an apprentice, kind of gopher person. There was 3 directors of a company. 2 of them were commercial real estate agents, and 1 of them was a builder. And they had their own little commercial agency, and they would put deals together for themselves and do small developments. So I was the first non-administrative employee, and when I did the interview, it was kind of apparent that they weren't really looking to pay much more than an apprentice's wage, and somehow I convinced them, I guess because I owned 2 properties at the time, that I was worth a try. They agreed to pay me a bit more, and I started, and I clearly remember the first day I turned up, because I got out of the briefcase, looked up at the office building and thought, I have no idea what this job is about. But it was on the Sunshine Coast and it was in property. That's all I knew.
In the meantime, he was employed there to learn a great deal about the local market and commercial property, which is now an area he specialises in.
So what they did is they taught me commercial agency, and obviously commercial property, as a method is very mathematical in its approach. So I was blessed that I worked with 2 guys who were, really on top of their game in terms of their local market. And for the next 3 or 4 years, they proceeded to teach me everything there was about commercial property. Sadly, the 3 of them kind of ate each other up in the end, and 2 bought 1 out, and then there was 1 left, and then eventually I ended up buying him out about 4 years later. And so during that time, though, the Sunshine Coast was growing, like most coastal areas, and you would get a tenant requirement or even a buyer requirement where they would be looking for a building with a red door and a green roof, or 300 square meters with this dimension or whatever, and quite consistently the buildings didn't exist that they wanted. So I guess I drew on 2 little tiny bits of experience. One was I built houses, so I understood that you could create something that didn't already exist. And I did tech drawing at school, so just from the point of view of just understanding how to draw something. And so I would say, well, I can't find what you're looking for, but here's a block of land. Here's a sketch, and I'm talking back of the envelope, really crude stuff. But if I could get their buy-in, then I would trudge off to a builder and say, would you buy this block of land and build this shed for this person? So what I kind of ended up falling into was, design and construct mentality for tenants. So, purpose-built requirements is another way to describe it.
The commercial property business, opened in the mid-90s, still operates today under different ownership.
Well, when that business fell apart, obviously there was it's a small town, there's a bit of rumour. So I got approached by another guy who'd been a big agent in Brisbane, and he just kind of come to the coast and was a one-man band, and he wanted to grow. So he approached me to employ me, and I said no, and explained what had gone on. And long story short, we best described merged the businesses, and that business still exists today. And on the Sunshine Coast, that's the Savills business. So it's now now owned by an international firm, but the genesis of that the business was was that phone call and our merger of our two little tin pot local agencies.
Grisman's early start as a property investor began on the Sunshine Coast when he was young and confident enough to have a go.
As I mentioned before, I bought my first house at 17, so while I was at the police, and if you like, I'll tell you that story because it's an interesting one. But in grade 10, a friend of mine, his parents had a caravan at Coolum on the Sunshine Coast. So we would go and stay there for 2 weeks and just surf our brains out for 2 weeks. So then when I was 17, I was then my then girlfriend's house and walked past a dad who was reading the Saturday paper, and there was an ad for some government land being auctioned at Coolum. And being, I was probably partly showing off, to be honest, but being the arrogant teenager that I was, I pointed to that and said, I'm going to buy one of those. So I then hatched a plan by talking to Dad about how we would make that work, and we ended up going to the government auction and bought 2 blocks of land. Dad bought one and I bought one, and what I didn't know at the time is that you weren't actually allowed to buy land, I don't think, until you were 18, but no one told us that. We literally didn't know. And the government terms are pretty attractive. You didn't need to qualify for a loan. What would happen is you'd pay 10% on the drop of the hammer, and then you'd pay another 10% in 12 months' time. So basically I had a year to work out how I was going to make this work. And, it's not something at all I would suggest people do. But again, at the time I was, probably young enough and dumb enough and ignorant enough and arrogant enough to have a go. And I think that's a trait that stands against a lot of property investors. They don't get in and have a go.
So how did you make it work and scrape through enough for the 10% within a year?
What happened was, at the end of the auction, we owned the property. We paid the 10%. And, I discussed with Dad borrowing the money off him. Unfortunately, my grandmother had just passed away, so there was a small inheritance. So he lent me the block was $32,500. You'd buy a few of those now if you get your hands on them right, each side of Coolum. So it was $3,250 we had to pay. So Dad lent it to me on the basis that I'd pay him back within a year. I'd kind of budgeted that, including beer money at the Fleece Academy. I think I was about $20 left over to be able to save up the payments that I needed to get to the end of the year. And as you do, a bit like a university assignment, kind of as the date comes, you haven't necessarily done enough or put enough away. So I went to a local real estate agent in Coolum, and as I walked in, the lady at the counter said, "Rentals are that way." And I went, no, I'm here to sell a block of land. Oh, okay, sir. Well, then, over this way. So eventually I found an agent who, suited me, and he came back with an offer for $47,500. And coincidentally, it was from the government. So the Housing Commission were looking to buy some land, and he was the government selling it to me for one figure, lending me the money, and then offering to buy it on another. It was a classic story.
That is classic.
And complete dumb luck.
From there, Grisman managed to build a house on his block of land and worked hard to create a property which would increase to a value of over $150,000.
But what ended up happening was they had another block in the street because they'd kept one back from the auction. And obviously right hand didn't know what left hand was doing. So they turned me down, and they pulled out on the contract. So I then went to the Queensland Police Credit Union, I guess, which was my bank at the time, and said, well, this land has now got to be worth this much, doesn't it? So will you give me the money to pay the government out? And they did. And through that process, I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I somehow worked out that I could get enough money also to build a house. So I think for the princely sum of about $85,000, I managed to build a house on this block of land. And then I kind of did what Dad did. I negotiated with the builder for no carpet, no driveway, no landscaping, and I just did all of that myself. So I literally slept on the floor for the first couple of weeks that the house was finished, and while I painted it myself inside, and I did my own driveway and did my own landscaping, all things that I'd just seen Dad do to save money. Obviously what I was doing is, creating equity and value and savings without necessarily knowing in a technical term. So.
Yeah. Wow, that is entrepreneurial success right there.
Yeah, it was a great time. I mean, I got roped some friends in, and we'd go into the pub at night and I'd chat them some beers, and they'd come and paint the next day. All the sorts of things that that people do.
Yeah.
But it worked, and at the end, I got it revalued, and it was worth, I think, from memory, about $135,000 or $140,000, and so that was kind of it. And then going back to the developer story, by the time I was at the developer, that property was probably worth 150 or 180,000. I can't remember exactly, but we were selling land. I found a block that I liked. I approached the developer that I worked for a chance to buy it and a bit of a discount, and I just did the same thing again.
Having come a long way since he was 17 and jumping in, by the time he reached 30 years of age, he had 30 properties under his belt and leapfrogging off the equity they produced.
I think by 25, I probably had, I can't remember exactly, but 3 or 4. I seem to remember at 26, I might have had 4 or 5. So, and largely speaking, it was buy a block of land, construct a building of some kind. I did my first duplex in that period in my mid-20s, because I kind of worked out mathematically that I could buy the land once and use it twice. So that, again, mathematical approach, and my commercial experience at the time would have, absolutely helped with that, as well as my background. But by the time I was 30, I had 30 properties, and really what I was doing is just leapfrogging equity. So at that stage, you didn't need lender's mortgage insurance at 85% LVR. So I would just constantly run the numbers on valuation and my LVR on my portfolio. And I've got a spreadsheet that I use to this day, very similar to what I used back then. And I'd just go, what do I think it's worth? Is there any more equity I can squeeze out? I would then go and talk to the bank, the valuer, do the rounds. And if I could prove up my equity, then I'd be on the hunt to find something else.
Oh, wow.
So it was, just a constant process of revisiting and running the same theory. I was definitely benefiting from having come from Sydney. I remember very clearly what happened with my parents selling out of Sydney to come to Queensland, and it's not unlike what's going on now, in my opinion. And this is the late 80s. They couldn't sell their house in Peakhurst for $180,000. So what they decided to do was they'd rent it out for a year, move to Queensland, and then, look to sell it down the track. Well, after they put it back on the market a year later, they sold it for $320,000 in the space of a week. So then the houses that we were living in and that my parents were looking at buying as a home in Queensland were, $60,000 to $80,000. Now, I didn't know much about job economics and macro and micro at that point, obviously, but I definitely remember that. Well, hang on, houses up here are a hell of a lot cheaper, and it's a much nicer place to live.
Yeah.
So I went hard in my 20s, thinking people will work this out. They'll work out that it's expensive down there and that it's cheaper up here, and this is a much better place to live. So I just went all in.
However, he does admit that sometimes being all in has its risks and drawbacks.
Look, being all in doesn't always work.
Yeah.
Plenty of times I've done it and got it wrong, as I'm happy to share. But at that time it did. So by the time I was 30, I owned 30 properties, and I specifically remember having a conversation with my then residential property manager, and I worked out that they weren't doing their periodic inspections. And my creations, my properties were pretty precious to me, and I just thought that wasn't right. And at about that time, property managers earned about $30,000 a year too. So I could do the maths. 30 properties, I was 30,000 a year. That all made sense. So I thought, I'm just going to hire my own person, and they'll manage my properties. And when they've got spare time, they can kind of do some of the admin load that comes with owning 30 properties.
Yeah, so you pretty much were starting to run your own agency by sounds of it.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what happened. So I kind of tied that in with a few other things, and friends and friends of friends, and I started the business that still runs to this day. It's called Property Only, which is a residential management specialist.
A lesson Grisman learned during his property investing journey was not to place life on the back burner while focusing on his goals. This came about when the famous GFC hit.
In the GFC, I got completely and utterly beaten up. The credit market that existed at the time was certainly something that I didn't even know it could exist in that fashion, let alone that it would play out the way that it did. So, if I try and take some gems of wisdom out of that, it's that, what I learned a lot through my investment strategy up until then is I was doing delayed gratification. I was putting all of my money into my property, and I was certainly having a good time, but largely speaking, I was completely focused on my property portfolio and kind of putting life to the side. And when the GFC hit, and as I say, I got beaten up really bad, I realised that there's no substitute for time. So it's all great to talk about investment strategy and wealth and doing this, but ultimately also you've got to have that balance. And that's very cliche, but it was so true.
So what happened in this worst case scenario come true?
So at 30, I've got 30 properties, and this is in the really crucial period around when the GST is introduced. And as we all now know, after that happened and before the GFC, I call it the period between the Gs. Up here on the Sunshine Coast, everything you did in property would turn to gold. And we had property literally double and double again in the space of about 5 or 6 years. So for someone who was owning, 30 plus properties, depending on where you want to peg the time, when you have your portfolio double and double again, and you've always run hard on using up all of your equity to reinvest, I literally couldn't buy properties fast enough or spend my money fast enough to keep all of my equity at use. And what I failed to do was kind of reset the strategy. So I got to a point where pre-GFC, I think I was up to 67 properties, but they weren't all just residential houses. There was a bunch of commercial properties in there because I was acting as a commercial agent. And very early on in my commercial career, I wouldn't invest in commercial property because I didn't want to be in conflict with my clients, was one reason. But secondly, the LVRs weren't as attractive. So, it was a lot harder to buy properties. But as I transitioned out of commercial property through my design and construct, I ended up becoming a I guess you'd say a hardcore developer. So therefore I started investing personally in commercial properties. So when I had the 67 odd properties pre-GFC, a bunch of that was commercial. So economic times were tough, interest rates were going up, credit was harder to get, and businesses were doing it tough. So I had huge cash flow shortages in my commercial portfolio. And then, as we now all know, the banks were hurting on their own credit. So they started to withdraw credit facilities, and in some cases, they'd do that overnight.
Wow.
So the music stopped and there weren't enough chairs to go around.
The only way he could overcome a situation of this magnitude was to live, learn, and alter his strategy.
I was in the wilderness for a long time, financially and mentally. I guess if I discuss how I treat my strategy now, I don't push as hard, and experience and age have certainly helped with that. But I don't push my LVRs as high. Like if I'm in today's terms at 80% and my portfolio goes to 70, I'm not looking to go out and use that 10% to go and buy something else. My LVRs are much more conservative. I'm extremely cautious about commercial debt and business debt. I mean, if you look at the banking industry now, largely they don't really want to lend to small and medium businesses. They're not interested if it's not, property or primarily a residential security. And in my opinion, a commercial debt is largely a 90-day bank bill that they can withdraw at any time on, some pretty horrendous conditions. So I'm extremely cautious about commercial property, despite the fact that I know it back to front. I just got beaten up, I tore up millions and millions of dollars. And whilst I definitely made some mistakes, no one can go through getting beaten up and say it was all them or it was all someone else, whether it's pushed too hard, made the wrong decision to buy the wrong building or, sign up with the wrong tenant, whatever it might be. But, we had a really unusual situation in the credit market where, there was mass withdrawal. So how do I deal with that now? I'm extremely conservative on the type of loans that I take, the type of properties that I buy, and the LVR that's there. So if there is a drama, I can potentially do what I could have done if I'd have taken a different strategy pre-GFC, I'd have sailed through and gone, GF what? Sorry, I don't even know what you mean.
The thing that Grisman likes the most about property investing is the simplicity of it, with 3 alternate ways in which to generate wealth from it.
With property, I don't know that I've literally been in the middle of a transaction and gone, there's some times certainly where I'm trying to solve a puzzle. I might like a property, but I can't quite work out how to buy it or how to approach it. And I go for a run, or go for a swim, or go for a surf, and Headspace allows you to to come up with the solution to the puzzle. But I look, the thing about property to me is it's really actually quite simple. There's 3 ways to make money in property. You buy something for less than it's worth. You buy something that you can value add in some way. So, renovation's the most commonly discussed one, but there's subdivision, there's addition of an additional dwelling that can produce income. There's the rezoning of it. There's so many things you can do to a property to value add it. And the third thing, of course, is that you can buy in a high growth area and do nothing except just wait for the tide to come in. So those 3 approaches are really simple. And if you can find a property that can combine all 3, then you can go really well, and they absolutely exist. The deal of the decade comes along once a fortnight. So you just have to be patient and wait for the right one. But all of those things are just about solving a problem. And, you mentioned it before, in terms of business and in terms of property, like go and find the crappiest property you can and solve the problem, and you'll create value. Like, it's that easy.
Yeah, and I love that. That is exactly true. And that's regardless whether it be in property investing or business or anything in life. If you can solve the biggest problem and add value, you've created wealth.
Even in relationships, you can have a relationship, but I don't just necessarily mean one at home. I mean with friends where, a tribulation can turn into a great asset in terms of that relationship if you can solve it.
So, was there anything that held Grisman back from initially investing into property?
I think that I was both ignorant and lucky early on that no, there wasn't. I didn't experience the fear that I can completely understand when people are looking to go and make a transaction. By the way, I think most of the time that fear is based on lack of knowledge. Like when people come to me and they do all of the time and ask for different help, I could categorize almost every conversation, at least 2 parts of it. And one is that they come and they go, I want to do this, this, or this. And I say to them, why do you want to do that? And they just go quiet and they kind of look at the sky, and first they're shocked and then they get it. And why are you doing it? Are you trying to make a capital gain? Are you trying to improve your life? Are you trying to get cash flow? If they can work out what the real reason they're doing it is, then all of a sudden their choices can really narrow down. And then the other thing that I say to them is, you're not sure about the value of it? Well, go and look at 50 of those same properties. And when you walk into the 51st, you'll be able to tell me within $5,000 how much it's worth.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you don't definitely know, then don't do it. Go and research.
In the previous episode with Grisman, he credited his father as a significant influential figure in his life, who mentored him in his journey.
The funny thing about that is that I don't ever remember he actually said anything to me. Like he definitely never said go and buy a property at 17. I mean, who would do that?
Yeah.
But I just watched him, and my dad, his father was an entrepreneur, and I didn't know that until my dad passed. We had those conversations you have when someone's passing, and he kind of told me a lot about his dad who'd passed away. I never met him when my dad was young. My dad's dad passed away, so he told me a lot about him then. But Dad himself was an employee all of his life. I guess I just took it in and kind of watched what he did in terms of value adding. And really all he was doing is he was just tinkering on improving what he had. So, yeah, he was a huge influence. I wish I had a bit more, mentors, if you like. I can't say that there's anyone specific. There's a couple of people professionally who I worked with. And I got to say, I didn't always like everything that they did. But there might be one thing I took from him and one thing from her and another thing from the next person. But in terms of reference materials, in the 90s, there wasn't much around, as anyone who was investing in the 90s will know. I mean, Jan Summers Not my first book, my first financial book I ever read was Noel Whittaker's Making Money Made Simple, I think it was called. I read that when I was 17, and that was a great book. So early on there wasn't a lot, but look, now there's so much reference material to find, in terms of social media and internet and stuff. I think you have to look at the purpose for which that material is put out.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is, white shoes, as we called them in the early 2000s on the Gold Coast. But a lot of property professionals are, Dracula in charge of the blood bank. They're selling these excellent investments, and they're ripping out fees of 30 grand each. And really, I can't see any value add that anyone can make because they're largely brand new house land packages. Yes, there might be a tide that'll wash in demographically in an area in some cases, though normally if it's new land, it's on the fringe. So I can't see much of that anytime soon. And one thing's for sure, they're not selling them for you, they're selling them for them. And that's the shame of the way that the industry's structured. But there's so much good information as well. You just have to kind of filter it and put your brain box on and, ask lots of questions instead of just deciding you're going to do something and then rocking off and doing it the next week, As I say, go and look at 50 houses. Go and look at 50 houses before you even decide what anything's worth or what you like.
Other resources Grisman turns to for mindset, inspiration are those like Think and Grow Rich and Property Investory.
And just pick up Jen Summers' book and just read that and start to form some opinions even in the current market off that. It's still a great resource material. And, there's a bunch of people without necessarily signaling them out that I've got a lot of time for in terms of their material, and they've got their hearts in the right place and stuff. So, yeah, it's tricky. But in terms of books, hey, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, I've heard in your podcast in the past, a number of people have suggested that. And there's a very good reason why that book's a classic cliche for business reading. It's a fantastic mental approach to life and business and property investment, and there's not one single property tactic or trick in it.
The best advice he has ever received: treat others how you want to be treated.
Treat others as you want to be treated, I think, be it. And it's not property advice, I get that, but I don't know, people could be nicer to each other, the world would be a lot better, and probably you'd find your property transactions work a hell of a lot better.
Grisman's strategy for purchasing property in Australia is centered on his 1 hour rule. Well,
if I'm talking residential property, then if you can gauge what the market is worth, and I'm not suggesting that you preconceive where you're going to buy here, but one of the rules I follow is I've got a 1 hour rule. If something goes wrong, I want to be there in an hour to make a decision about how to fix it. So I live on the Sunshine Coast in God's country in Queensland. And do I own any property in Adelaide? No. It's too far. Now, I could get there. I can get a plane. I could even convince myself that Sydney, where I used to live, is only an hour away on a plane, but it's a pain in the bum if I've got to go there and fix it. So I balance out my lifestyle against, my investment strategy, I suppose. And I'm lucky I live in a high growth area that provides lots of opportunity. But the 101 2.2 is work out what is in the marketplace. And so in other words, how much is a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house? Can you buy a block of land and get a building built for cheaper than that? And if you can, then, can you add those two things together and have them worth what, by the time you complete the product, has it cost you 20% less than what the prevailing market price is? And if it is, then you go and do it.
He expands on his formula for 1 + 1 = 2.2, which determines the overall value of a property in the aftermath of adding value.
The way that I've described it probably makes it sound like I'm thinking about a housing estate.
That's
what it sounds like, doesn't it? Yeah, it's not. Look, there are plenty of, blocks of land in, let's call it suburbia, that haven't been built on. So, there's an opportunity. Like if you can find a block of land in an older suburb, and what I mean by older is 10 years, say, since it's been developed, then that's really easy to run the maths. Okay, how much is the block of land? how much is it to build a house, and what will that be worth compared to, the 5 or 10 houses that are for sale in the neighbourhood. But where it works best is if you can find an old house that's on a large block of land. I've got half a dozen of these projects on the go right now, where I like to look for an old house on a large block of land, and I then look to what can I use the backyard for, because backyards don't need to be as big as they used to be, probably practically as well as in terms of urban land use. But can I build another house out the back? Can I cut the backyard off and create an extra block? Can I build a second dwelling out there and call it a duplex, or can I just build a dwelling and call it a granny flat and get income? So what I'm looking to do is value add to that property. So then indeed, if I use a really simple example, let's say I bought a $500,000 house on a large block of land. When I cut the backyard off, what's the front house worth? Now, if it's a 1,000 square metre block and the front house is still on if it's a 2,000 square metre block and the front house is still on 1,000 square metres, it's probably still worth $500,000.
Correct. Yep.
So then I've got a free block of land out the back. Now, I obviously have to cut it off and put cost into infrastructure and driveways and sewer and water and whatever it is. But if I can, say, spend $100,000 doing that, and that block of land is worth $200,000, well, then I've just added value. I've just got to, 1 + 1 = 2.2.
With this scenario becoming more and more common, Grisman understands the reason behind it and explains why the mathematics of it makes sense.
Lots of friends that live in the Shire and in Sydney, and got to say a few of them aren't that happy with it. But people are coming in and buying old houses and knocking them down and building duplexes, and they don't like it because they live in their nice old houses and it affects their neighbourhood, and I can completely understand that. But the reason that those people are doing that is they're running the maths. They're going, well, this house might cost 1.5 to knock down, but I can then build a duplex, and that duplex might cost, $1 million to build two, pretty decent homes. So I'm in for 2.5. But if they're worth 1.5 when they're finished because they're brand new, and yes, they're a duplex with a common wall or a duplex title, but they've still got a decent sized yard area. They're brand new compared to the older houses in the area. And the land, the deal might owe them 2.5, and yet they're potentially on the market for 3. One thing I can be sure about, if there's a bunch of them going on in a suburb, not every one of the people who are doing them are paying cash for the whole lot. They're probably borrowing money from a bank, and therefore valuers are supporting the maths that they're using in their approach.
For those who feel like they can't get into the property market right now, he endorses rent vesting as a great approach to kickstart your journey.
And look, I'm sick of hearing this. I can't afford a house here. I can't afford a house. That is the most nonsensical thing I've ever heard. What you're really saying is you can't afford a house in the suburb that you actually want to live in or that you grew up in. Do you expect to be able to buy a house in the suburb that you grew up in when your parents probably bought that house a whole bunch of years ago? No, you probably have to buy somewhere else. I mean, rent vesting is a completely viable way of approaching the property market, where maybe you don't live in the first 3 or 4 houses that you own because you're renting them out and creating value and stuff. And you might be doing that because your why is that you want to be able to own your own home. So you invest in a handful of properties, you make some money, you build that snowball up until you can actually go and buy the house that you want in that market. You don't have to go and demand it straight away.
And for those who are short on time and caught up with other commitments, Grisman says the only way to get it done is to make the time.
It's tricky. Look, I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to that. And to be honest, there shouldn't be. I mean, if people are time poor and they're looking to invest, it's going to be hard. But you just have to start to drill down. So, if I was someone on a pretty average wage and I was living in Sydney, then I might be looking at Western Sydney. I might be looking at Queensland. Now, my investment philosophy of an hour away doesn't necessarily have to be someone else's. I'm probably privileged enough that I know enough that I can invest here. But if I lived in a most beautiful place on earth and it wasn't a growth town, I wouldn't be investing here because the maths would tell me not to. So I would go and find a town that I can do it. So yeah, if you're time poor, then you're going to have to start with some holistic research. I mean, someone like Michael Matuzik in Queensland, who puts out a whole bunch of data for like $100 a year, that would be a great place to start. Terry Wright is another one up here on the Sunshine Coast. I'm just talking about people local to my area. So, and for every region that people live in, there'll be a bunch of people. So just go and start to filter that down, and then understand your why and your what. And part of your what is, well, how much do I think that I can borrow on my wage? How much deposit have I got? And if the answer is you've only got $400,000, then okay, ring Residex and say, how many suburbs are there in Australia for average price of 400,000? Okay, out of those, can you give me the top 20 that have decent growth characteristics? Now, is it going to be easy? No, but if it was easy, everybody would do it.
Although he prefers not to disclose the details of his current portfolio, Grisman now appreciates what he has in life in contrast to all he has previously lost.
In my pre-GFC period, I never had a problem answering that question. I wore it as a badge of honour. I knew exactly how many properties to the T. I could probably tell you the net worth. I could probably tell you my percentage LVR because I knew my maths really well. But to be fair, I was bragging because I owned more than most people that ever, than anyone that I ever knew. So look, I don't answer that question anymore, and it's not because I'm hiding. It's just because it's not my badge of honour. It's not my identity anymore. It's not who I am. So, but what I can say to you is that, running into the GFC, as I said, I had 67 odd properties and I got completely beaten up. I then, on the back of that, got divorced and lost most of what I had. And it was, and what's worse than the money that I lost, because it's just money. I didn't start with any money. So it wasn't like I really lost anything if you think about it. It was just an ego. But I lost time. I lost lots of time in having to deal with that period in my life. And it was a really unhappy time that, frankly, I'm lucky I survived. So what do I have now? Look, I have a beautiful, I'm remarried. I have a beautiful wife. We have a fantastic family environment. I have a daughter that I got a 2-for-1 deal when I married my wife. So I have a daughter who's with us full time, and my son is with us half of the time. And I pick him up from school and drop him off, and I'm full time dad on that week. My wife and I run a handful of property-related businesses, as I mentioned before, and we have a decent-sized property portfolio, and we have a really specific plan about how we go about living our life.
Because at the end of the day, the purpose behind building a property portfolio is to cement our lifestyle goals.
And if I use my failure as a way to cement that, like, again, pre-GFC, I could have sold up a number of times, paid out all of the debt, and never had to think about working again. And I had one particular friend of mine say, why don't you do that? And I didn't really, it's only on reflection that I really understood what he was saying. It was a bit cryptic. Maybe he was trying to be nice, but I didn't get it. But I was just like at the crease playing cricket. They didn't get me out, so I just kept batting. And I kind of didn't necessarily have a purpose in mind. I mean, what was it going to be, 167, then 267? And often when people say those numbers, they've just pulled it out of their bum, just kind of made the number up. Like, if you can find out what you actually really want in life and then start to convert the maths back, and then, I think that's a good way. And from a residential strategy perspective, I'll offer a really simple way to do that. If you think you want $100,000 in retirement or $200,000 in retirement or whatever that figure might be, then just assume that on a property portfolio, you're going to get a 5% gross return. So if you want $300,000 worth of income a year, then you probably want to own about $6 million worth of unencumbered real estate. So go and buy $12 million worth of unencumbered real estate in the right areas, hold it for 10 years, wait for it to double in value, sell half to pay out the debt on the other half.
A personal habit that Grisman believes has contributed to his success in property is being able to push harder to achieve something than anyone else.
I think biologically I'm pretty lucky. Maths is a strong suit, and I can see it in my son too. He's got a very high IQ, and he just gets maths. That's where I talk about the birth lottery. Like, you can think you're as smart as you like, but ultimately, most of it wasn't your doing. You just got to try and do the best that you can with who you are. So personal traits. Look, I watched my dad never stop, and it's a trait that I have to tone down on myself. I definitely can easily work through the whole weekend and push too hard. So I think I'd say that with most people, I think that their best trait is also their biggest negative. And for me, it definitely is. My biggest trait is I can push hard. I can push harder than anyone that I've met. But that definitely is a negative for me at times. And that can be on a personal front, but it can also be property investment front.
So how has he been able to overcome his best trait morphing into his worst trait?
Sadly, I got to say, I think, making enormous stuff ups. And in Australia, I don't know where it comes from, if it's the tall poppy syndrome or what it is, but we just don't embrace failure enough. And, the only way you're going to learn and improve is by trying things. And if you think that you're going to nail everything that you try, you're just living in la-la land. Now, I struggle with failure just like anyone, but we have to embrace it. So I think that if I've got balance, it's because I've had some epic failure in my life, failed marriage, the GFC was an absolute disaster for me. I lost lots of time, I lost lots of money, and I wouldn't wish what I went through on anybody. And yet it is probably the single most impactful thing in my lifestyle right now, because it gave me great perspective. It helps me keep in check the ability to push way too hard.
I really admire that, and I appreciate you sharing that, because it's so important, because it's so easy to see how successful people have achieved such great success, but until you actually step behind the curtains and find out, wow, they've gone through a lot of adversity like you have, it really puts things into perspective, and that's why I think it's so important to learn from people like yourself as well.
You can have some fun with it too. I mean, I get people who, I literally wouldn't get through a week without 3 or 4 phone calls of someone looking for some advice on something. I do some consulting on projects and for people and stuff. I've proudly helped about 40 or 50 people buy their first house, and I help friends, build duplexes and that sort of stuff, and it gets me off. But someone will ring me up and they'll say, "I'm wanting to do this," and I'll say to them, "Why?" And they don't know. And I go, "Well, what are you doing it for then?" And so I think that if they can distill down why they're really doing it, then in some cases, it might be a friend who's got 4 businesses and he's talking about buying a 5th one. And I go, "Well, what are you doing that for? Do you really do you need some extra money? Do you need, are you bored? Have you got nothing to do?" and sometimes, that we just don't stop and ask ourselves those questions enough. And I think that if we did, we'd be much happier in life. And I'm not preaching here. I still get it wrong every day, but it's good to be doing it more than I used to do, that's for sure.
A lot of property investors are aware of their why when starting out, but Grisman says that it's also a question of what.
By the way, on property, I think the second question is the what. And, I did a little video series on this that I share with our clients and stuff, particularly in our property management business, but friends who want to invest and, consult, people I consult to and stuff. And it's like, the first bit is the why are you doing it, so get your kind of mental strategy right about what you're going to do. And the second bit is the what. So it's your circumstances. Well, okay, you want to renovate a house. Have you ever picked up a hammer? Or do you know how to organize a team of tradespeople? Or do you have enough equity? Or do you have enough cash flow? Or more importantly, than most of the time, do you have enough time? So, if you can answer your why and your what, then I reckon when you're making your property decision, you're literally down to a handful of things to decide between rather than a really wide gambit of your options.
So, if he were to meet himself from 10 years ago, what would he say?
Go surfing more.
I knew you'd say that.
Oh, look, seriously, I'm going to give surfing a pitch here for anyone that doesn't surf. It's just the ultimate activity outside of, things we might do at home. And you get to exercise. You don't sweat because you're in the ocean. You're sitting in the biggest energy source on the planet, being the ocean. What is it? 70% of the ocean is covered in water, and your body's made up of 70% in water. Tell me that's not a huge coincidence. And you get to meditate while you're out there. You sit there, and it's pretty hard to think about too much in the surf when you're analysing where you're sitting on the bank or the reef and which way the wind's coming and where the other surfers are sitting in the water. And, you got to be on the job, and yet you're not thinking about too much.
For the next 5 years, Grisman is excited about continuing to help people.
Look, I get a lot out of helping people to do stuff. Look, normally the wins for us is we get to manage their property. It's not exactly great financial remuneration, but it's really satisfying to help people. But I thought for a long time that property for me was about, the maths, and certainly in my younger days, the ego and all that sort of stuff. But and we haven't even touched on some of the bigger projects that I've done professionally, 10-story buildings and shopping centres and, town centres and those sorts of things. But I get off on, long after the money's gone, being able to hang my hat on that project. My kids are sick of hearing about We Drive Fast, and I go, I designed that, or I built it, or I did the deal to put the tenants in place, or whatever it might be. So I like creating things. So and I think if you analyse your traits when you're younger, and for me, I used to like drawing and kind of building cubby houses out of the cushions on the couch. I just like to create stuff, and I think all of us like to create stuff a bit more than we maybe give ourselves time for in most of our lives. So if you ask me what I'm most excited about, look, I enjoy creating homes for people to live in. I like, repurposing, commercial buildings and older residential buildings and stuff. It's, I find it really satisfying. And by the way, if you do it, you're absolutely going to stuff up all the time. Like, just yesterday I was in an old house that we're renovating, and I said, during the project, put the sink there in this is a vanity, in a bathroom. And then I turn up on site, we sheeted the walls, and I go, what an idiot. What did you put it there for? Now, I've probably only done that, 50 times in terms of a renovation. And I just go, well, what were you thinking? It's got to go over there. But, in the scheme of things, does it really matter?
If you want to connect with Grisman and find out more about his mindset and strategy, you can contact him via email or social media.
Just reach out anyway. I'm, kind of on most of the social medias and Facebook and LinkedIn and stuff. But look, my email address is kgrisman, Grisman, @propertysurfer.com.au. My mobile's 0413 537 000. If you've got a question, ring me up. And try and be nice and have thought about it beforehand before you ring me up and badger me. I've got a website. We're just actually playing around with the moment, so it might be under construction, but be with us. But it's just keithgrisman.com.au, which has just got a bunch of, probably done 150 projects. So it's got a little story and a summary, the good, the bad, and the ugly about some of the stuff. So you might find some useful information in there. There's no sell in there, so it's all free info.
Thank you to Keith Grisman, our guest on this episode of Property Investory. If you want to hear more about his journey, then visit our website at propertyinvestory.com.